Welcome to the Deep Dive,
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive podcast, Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast. In some different digs here. Hopefully I sound okay. I don't have a mic or anything with me, so just having to use what my laptop has, but it's nice to be up here in Seattle, ready for Dev Camp. Had a great time in Vegas with you, RJ, for the draft. That was a ton of fun, and we get to keep the ball rolling up here in the Emerald City.
Yeah, and plenty going on today, too. I mean, the reason you're up here, it's super busy. Day one of free agency, July 1st. And of course, you knew we had to get an emergency podcast out here. It also happens to work out that it's the normal time on a Monday. But yeah, lots of stuff to cover today. It's been an interesting one.
Definitely. But of course, we're not going to forget to thank our wonderful sponsor, Queen Anne Beer Hall. It feels really good to be up here in the city with Queen Anne Beer Hall. RJ, I'm going to have to get over either there or to the Moss Bay Hall location. But I know you recently were over at Queen Anne Beer Hall.
I was, and they were asking, where's Dylan? Where's Dylan? I told him soon enough he's coming to Queen Anne Beer Hall. But yeah, it was a great time. I mean, there was no better place I could have gone for Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final to watch that Panthers versus Oilers. That was really fun. The crowd there was very pro Oilers, so a lot of disappointed fans there, but the atmosphere was second to none. I mean, everybody was super into it. Even the last minute, the "Let's Go Oilers" chants. I know, Dylan, you're probably supporting Florida there, but just love to see the energy in the building, as they say. Right. That was awesome. I also got to try the burger of the month for last month, the LGBTQ smash burger. Very good. It's a lot, Dylan. It's like a double burger, and they've got, oh man, there's so much piled on there with like the bacon, the guac, the queso. I mean, it's kind of like a Mexican style BLT, but with more beef. So if you're into that sort of thing, although now it's too late, actually. It's July. We got to see what the next burger of the month is. But also really quickly want to give a shout out to, there were a few members of the ECH community that were there that heard on our last podcast that I was going to be there. They came over there to watch the game with us and to have a good time at the Queen Anne Beer Hall. So just want to shout them out real quick. Thanks for coming. It was nice to see you.
Yeah, no, that is fantastic. Love when the ECH community shows up for stuff like that, especially on such short notice. Because last week it was like
less than a day.
Yeah,
a couple hours maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So that was really awesome. And then also real quick, because you have your July Armchair GM stream over on Patreon coming out in just a couple days. So why don't you plug that?
Right. So July 4th. So it's pretty early in the month. And the reason we're doing that is because, unfortunately, Cap Friendly is going away. So we're going to give it one last send off here before it goes away on the 5th. And I'm going to do the Armchair GM stream on July 4th. Now, I know a lot of people probably have plans that day, being the 4th of July. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little post on Patreon for our patrons, and you can kind of leave your questions, leave your things, everything you would normally put in chat. You can leave it there so that if you're not able to catch it live, which I understand if you're not, then you can go back and watch the video on demand later, and we can kind of have it be interactive that way. So if you are able to catch it live, though, it is July 4th, 7 p.m. And if not, make sure to leave those questions, comments, anything you want us to look at for that Armchair GM stream in the I'll put a post on Patreon, leave it in a comment there. By the time you're listening to this, it'll be up and you'll have seen it. So make sure to go ahead and do that. Looking forward to seeing everyone there while we discuss a lot of the things we're going to be discussing today, Dylan, because the Kraken made some big moves.
Yes, they did. Brought in the two richest contracts Ron Francis has ever signed. Forget just with the Kraken, just ever as a general manager. They were signed today, bringing in two massive free agents. First, of course, bringing Brendan Montour, formerly of the Florida Panthers, just won the Stanley Cup a couple days ago, a week ago. And then Chandler Stephenson of the Vegas Golden Knights. So won the cup the prior year. So bringing in some recent cup champions there. RJ, let's go ahead and start with Montour, though. This one at first really caught me off guard. I was like, okay, what are we doing? I wasn't thinking defense when I was thinking Kraken being active in free agency this year. That wasn't necessarily something a lot of us had brought up much. That being said, though, Montour, very offensive defenseman, really good at moving the puck, finding the open guy, running a power play, all of that kind of stuff. So kind of as it sat with me, it started to make more and more sense. And I can go into more detail in a little bit, but I do want to hear your first reaction when you saw the news.
I couldn't believe it, really. I just was very surprised that that was kind of the player that they chose to go after and to sign that rich of a deal, too. This is so out of character for Ron Francis. We'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the big picture. But yeah, this one really caught me off guard. I think it's telling that we didn't mention his name once last week when we were doing our free agency preview. We did mention Stephenson, but we didn't mention Montour. And I agree with you. Actually, at first I was thinking, oh my God, what are they doing? But the more I thought about it, the more this one, like you said, sat a little bit better with me. And I kind of understood what they were going for with this move. As far as the fit right now, like you said, Montour is a good puck mover. He's good at getting the puck up the ice, and he is going to help facilitate a lot more offense, even if he isn't a forward himself. And so I think that fit, at least for right now, is very good. As far as the contract, look, I said that it could age very poorly. I still stand by that. But you know, when you're trying to improve the team right now, those are the kind of things you have to do in free agency if you're going to want to make this move. Still don't love the contract necessarily, but I think as far as a fit on the ice for right now, you can't really do better as far as a defenseman.
Right, and the particulars of that contract, for those who haven't
Yeah,
seen
I
it,
should mention that, by the way. Yeah, it was so a 7-year contract at 7.14 million per year. So that is a big ticket. He is the second highest paid player on the Kraken by AAV, right behind Vince Dunn's 7.25. So you're kind of loading up with a couple big contracts on the back end. And yeah, I mean, one thing about this contract too, just kind of how rare it is to see it, given a player at his age. By the way, Brandon Montour is 30 years old. He just turned 30, but he is 30. And I was looking around for comparable contracts. And so I found every free agent defenseman who was 30 years old or older and signed for 7 or more years at 8+% of the salary cap. I think it's like 8.1 for Montour here, looking for comparable contracts. The complete list is only 2 names. It's Brandon Montour and Alex Pietrangelo. Those are the only 2 that have ever really matched that criteria for a contract of being that long for a defenseman at that age and taking up that much of the cap. So the Pietrangelo signing worked out for Vegas. They ended up winning a Stanley Cup. That was fine. But I'm not really using that to try and make a comment on the contract one way or another, except to just say it's pretty rare to see this, which adds to the surprise that I had.
Yeah, it's an unprecedented contract in multiple ways, right? I mean, we talk about it from Ron's perspective. He, was the guy that like never went above $6 million as a cap hit a couple of seasons ago. To now he's signing this deal that just has one comparable ever. That's pretty interesting. It's it is what it is. I think, we've talked about the cap goes up this off season and then it goes up a little bit more next off season. And then, hey, look, the CBA is in 2 years that they're going to have to renegotiate. Who knows what happens with the salary cap at that point? If things are going to go up from there, I don't know. So, it's not too bad. It's not going to be 8.1% of the cap next year. It'll be under 8% next year in year 2 of the contract. The term, yeah, it's a little concerning. 30 years old, 7 years. We know that not many of those guys play that long. And look, Brandon Montour, he's a little injury prone. And so I think the thing that I immediately thought of when I saw that term was this seems like one of those contracts that will end on LTIR. Like, it just kind of has that vibe to it. Obviously, you don't want that to happen. It means that he would suffer some sort of injury, significant injury, maybe a little later on, or his body's just not going to be able to recover the same way as he gets older. But we are seeing that around the NHL more and more. Guys who sign these kinds of free agent deals and then they kind of hit that age and what goes on, and maybe there's some shenanigans there, but you see them end up on LTIR. The cap hit doesn't end up meaning anything for the team. They still get paid. Everybody's kind of happy, so to speak. And so I do wonder, that is something that's kind of floating around in the back of my mind with this one, is that is a very much a potential outcome for this contract. And then it doesn't feel as bad when you're talking about seasons where he's 37 years old and you're having to pay him 7.14 million.
Right. And especially if the last 2 years of that deal, if LTIR is a factor here, that can make things up. Basically, if you look at, because a lot of the analytics people would post, about really every big free agent signing today. And if you look at Montour, it seems about fair value for now and really for the next 3 years or so.
Yeah.
And then the number the cap hit is a little bit higher than what the value he's going to bring as it kind of tails off, as you would expect as a player hits 34, 35, 36. And so at least for the time being, seems like fair value. And I think it makes the Kraken a much better team right now.
Yeah, it does. And also, by the way, just before I get into the fit with him more specifically, not many of the contracts signed today project okay 3 years from now. Like the fact that this one does is actually a pretty decent win for Ron Francis, because a lot of these do not look that good.
There was a lot of money thrown around today. A lot of, I think, unwise money too. So, I mean, I guess if you graded on that curve, but GMs are really shelling out the cash.
Well, I mean, this is something that we see in other sports. Whenever the salary cap jumps, right, that first free agency, all of a sudden GMs, especially the ones that like Ron Francis, who have that kind of mandate or the ability to spend to the cap, they go out there and they do it. Unlike in other sports, say like the NBA or the NFL, where you just saw all the contracts kind of scale up. I feel like with this one, GMs were just kind of like, oh, I can bring on an additional, middle class free agent this year that I wouldn't otherwise be able to bring in, rather than the contracts themselves looking too bloated. I feel like a lot of the people's numbers, like Brandon Montour, this is probably around the number he was going to get from somebody, given he is 2 years removed from a 70-point campaign, something like that. And so I feel like that's kind of what's going on this year with the big blow up in free agency that we've seen. As for Montour's fit with the Seattle Kraken, this is, and I put out a tweet about this, this is them giving Coach Dan Riker Evans, essentially, but an NHL ready and an NHL veteran and an NHL guy who has already put up massive numbers at the NHL, doing a very similar thing to what Riker Evans was doing for Coach Dan Bylsma at the Coachella Valley level. And so I think that's really intriguing and exciting for me. Brandon Montour is a guy who can skate very well. He skates up the ice. He can help feed the transition game that Dan Bylsma likes to play. Like so much of the NHL is having to transition to. I've been talking about this a lot in the past couple of weeks as we've been watching the playoffs, particularly with our patrons over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey. I've been talking about how the teams that have really embraced the transitional style, those are the ones having success right now at the NHL level. Like those are the successful NHL teams. Brandon Montour is a defenseman that can feed that transition, can participate in that transition at 5-on-5. So I think that's a lot more fun. You and I were talking about this earlier at KCI while we were waiting to talk to Ron. And this kind of works for both their signings today. Coach Dan likes to play more of a north-south game than what the Kraken were maybe used to playing last year and under Coach Hackstall. Brandon Montour and Chandler Stephenson fit into that idea. So I think that's what's coming. The big thing, though, is going to be the power play, right? We all know the Kraken power play has struggled over the last couple of years. Yes, there's going to be a new coach involved and in charge of the power play, so that's going to change some things. But also, you're going to have Brandon Montour to run your first unit power play now. And this is a guy that 2 years ago had 30 assists on the power play. Right? Like he knows how to run a power play extremely well. He does it with his kind of rover roaming style that I really enjoy because it leads to player movement. He's going to move himself from spot to spot, which forces the other players to move, in relation to him, right? Go fill the spot he left. That's going to add player movement to the Kraken power play. If you've listened to any of our post-game lives, any of the Deep Dive podcasts, you know how important I think that is for the power play, how much I wanted to see that on the Kraken power play. Just having him in the lineup means that regardless of who the coach is, we're going to see player movement because he is going to make it happen. That's just the way he plays. I can't see that changing here, RJ, and that makes me very excited.
Right. This is going to be a huge boost for the power play, and that's where he brings a lot of his value. And a lot of that player movement, that stems from his ability to skate. He's an excellent skater. That's, one of the hallmarks of his game. And that's something that Ron Francis pointed out as well, because I did ask him, I was curious about the 7-year terms on both of these deals for 30-year-old players, which is a very rare combination. I said, what about these two guys makes you confident in kind of giving out that 7-year term? And I mean, the first thing he said was, well, this time of year, if you're not giving out 7 years, you're just not going to get the player. So there's a leverage issue there. But then he also said that they're both excellent skaters. And that's, if you're going to make a bet on somebody having that longevity, that you want to bet on somebody who's a really good skater, because that's going to help them last in the league a long time.
Yeah, definitely. And Montour is excellent skater from a defensive standpoint. I do want to talk about another aspect of his game, though, and that is the offense and the way he sees the ice. Because he likes to move, he likes to walk the blue line. He finds a lot of good shooting angles for himself. He finds a lot of ability to open up interesting passing lanes that defenses aren't always looking for, so he can find his teammates and kind of put them in good positions to score. I think that's going to add another element to what the Kraken could potentially do offensively this upcoming season. I'm really excited about that. I would say, RJ, when you're looking at offensive defensemen, is kind of in that one tier below the like truly elite special guys, right? Where you have like obviously there's like Cale Makar or Quinn Hughes or Miro Heiskanen. I kind of put his offensive game at that like kind of one tier below, where he's kind of capable of seeing those things, capable of generating offense at close to that level. I mean, we're talking about a ton of points he put up not last season, but the year prior. Last season he was injured. This past season he was injured for the start. He had off-season surgery. He got going slow, wasn't going to put up that same level of production. But if you go back to the year in which he was really, really producing, you're going to see a guy who is capable of playing up to that level. The difference, I would say, that kind of keeps him from entering that true like elite tier stuff with those other guys is just maybe like it's a little bit more streaky with him, right? Like he might go 10, 15, 20 games playing at that level, and then he kind of takes a step back for another 5 to 10 games. And I feel like that's what we saw in the Stanley Cup final from him this year, because I know that that's probably a question a lot of people who watch that Stanley Cup final are asking right now is, wow, you guys are saying he's a great fit, he can do all of this special stuff, but wasn't he the guy that late in that Stanley Cup final against the Oilers got pulled off the power play? You're saying he's good on the power play. Didn't we just see him get pulled off of the power play? And we did. And I think that is one of the things, because I've watched him going back to his Anaheim days, pre-Buffalo, pre-Florida. And this is just kind of always how he's been. He's always been a streaky guy. Is that when you play the style of game that he plays, where you're having to make those split-second decisions, when you are thinking at that high level and you're trying to make those super high-skill plays, you have to make those decisions and you have to just go with it. Right? You don't have the ability. A lot of times you're working now with like windows that are, normally they're half-second windows I talk about. These times they're like quarter-second windows when you're talking about these truly elite plays that you're trying to make. So you have to really just trust your instincts and go. Like the moment you start registering what might be there, you have to already be in the process of going for it. And I think what sometimes happens with him, and what happened with him in the Stanley Cup final, was he got burned earlier on in the series doing that, and he made a couple bad reads, which just happens. I mean, it happens to everybody. And he started second guessing himself a little bit. And instead of making those quarter-second decisions, he was starting to make half-second decisions. But then he wasn't able to really play his game. It starts creeping in, right? The doubt, whatever. It's Stanley Cup final. It's a big moment. Oh my gosh, what's going on? And I think that caused him just to play it a little bit too safe. You could tell that he wasn't always getting over to pucks super quickly because he was kind of second guessing, like, okay, do I have to make sure I'm back enough? I don't want to let another shorthanded opportunity go. And so I think that's what we saw from him late in that series. I think that's pretty normal. I've seen that from him. I've seen that from tons of guys in the past. We've seen that from Vince Dunn at times, right? Especially in his growth. Go back to season 1 with the Kraken. That was something that you see from, like I said, those kind of like second tier, high level offensive guys. So I just want to say, for the people that are maybe concerned about that, I get it. And I saw the same thing you're seeing, but I'm also telling you not to worry about it. That's just kind of part of the experience. That's part of who he is. That's part of that kind of player. And I got to think that he's going to get it back pretty quick with the Kraken. He'll probably have it, through training camp and be ready to go through preseason, all that good stuff. I'm not worried about it long term. It's just kind of something that goes with the territory of being a high level offensive defenseman that isn't Cale Makar, Quinn Hughes.
Right. It's part of the overall package. But I want to back up to something that you talked about kind of earlier in your answer, and that is the overall production from Brandon Montour and the offensive production. You kind of put him a tier below those top guys. And you did mention a couple seasons ago, he had a 73-point season. That is elite production, right, from a defenseman. But if you look at his career as a whole, that is a bit of an outlier. 73 points. His other career high, if you take that season out, his career high scoring season was the year before, 37 points. Now that's a huge gap. And so it does beg the question, which is more the accurate for Brandon Montour and what he actually brings? Is it that 73-point defenseman, that 37-point defenseman, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not working with like two screens very efficiently here, like my normal setup. I mean, one of the things that I think about with some of that is just like you look at that season in which he puts up 73 points in Florida. That's the first season that he's playing like top pairing minutes, where he's playing like 24 minutes a night. So I think some of that is just that normal like kind of progression of just more ice time equals more production, right? Like there is an element of that. Um, that being said, I think it was also an element of, look, he's playing with the best team that he had played with at that point, realistically, and guys just pop off for a year, right? Do I think he's a normal 70 kind of point guy? Probably not. That if he was, then that's like first tier, top tier, offensive defenseman. I think he's realistically somewhere more in the like he can be like a 50-point guy for the Kraken, right? But we saw this and had these same questions with Vince Dunn, and was he for real? Had he kind of like found his thing and everything finally clicked for him, and like this is the player that he's going to be? And I think that that's what kind of happened for Brandon Montour in Florida. And you look at his production both these last two regular seasons there, and then also with the playoff production that he's had for them on their last two cup runs. And I think that it's just one of those things where he was in the right spot with the right coach who was able to kind of make everything coalesce and come together for him. And then he just becomes that guy. I've talked about in the past, defensemen have longer development, right? Like it takes them longer before they can kind of hit that next level. We saw it again firsthand with Vince Dunn. I think it's very possible that that's what happened with Brandon Montour, given that he was moved around so early on in his career, bounced from place to place. I think just being able to be there and kind of come together and bring it all together really, really helped him out in Florida. Similar to say like a Gustav Forsling in Florida, right? Like I think Florida that coaching staff knows how to train these guys up, how to make them see the game in maybe a different way that then starts making it all click for them. And I think Montour's there.
Right. And so that is just one of my questions that I have is can he up that production aside from that other season and see if the team fit can make it work. One thing though that I do not question is his ability to munch minutes. I mean, he played a lot. He averaged over 24 minutes of ice time 2 years ago, a little over 23 minutes of ice time this past season, and that includes an injury that he was dealing with as well. So he's able to play huge minutes. And I mean, that's one of the most valuable things that you can get in a blue liner, especially if you make it to the playoffs and come playoff time, where you can have a guy that goes out there for 23, 24 minutes plus and can be positive production wise for you and can be an asset rather than a liability.
Yeah, exactly. And then like on the defensive side of things, I wouldn't call him like a shutdown defender or anything. I don't think that that's what many people would know him for. But when you look at like all the analytics models and stuff, even though the point production isn't always there, what is clear is that he is great at helping drive offense. Now I know he was sheltered pretty good in Florida. If you go and you look at like his zone starts and stuff, but unlike a lot of other players around the league that can get those sheltered zone starts, but then maybe their Corsi doesn't line up with it. His Corsi lines up with those zone starts. He doesn't kind of regress there. And then if you look at stuff like relative expected goals percentage when he's on the ice, or even just his team's expected goals percentage when he's on the ice, it's pretty darn good. And you're talking about a guy who's playing a lot of minutes, and it's kind of something that can't just be explained by him getting 55% offensive zone starts, right? The fact that he's like a relative expected goals percentage, I think this past season of like 15%, like it's pretty good. Like that means they're 15% better when he's on the ice than when he's not on the ice. So I think he's got a good all around game. And again, he's just one of those guys that helps funnel things to the offensive zone. And then once they're in the offensive zone, particularly on the power play in those situations, he's able just to help his teammates convert.
Right. And that's the thing is how he plays with his teammates and is able to kind of distribute and create offense elsewhere. Do you have anything else on Montour before we kind of talk the player, before we talk about where he fits in on the Kraken blue line? Because that raises some very interesting questions.
Yes, it does. Just that, one, he's excited to be here. and he talked about how important it was for him to go to a place that he was wanted. And I will note that like this was his big opportunity to secure the bag, and he did with the Kraken. And so, congrats to him on that. That's a good job.
Yep.
And also that I also think partly bringing him in, this is also like a cultural signing for the Kraken, in the sense that we talked a lot about kind of their culture and the locker room culture and what was it at the end of last season. Brandon Montour is a guy that's very well known for being loose, lighthearted, fun, one of the locker room DJs, one of those guys that kind of can keep things when things get rough from feeling so rough for a lot of the other players in the locker room. And so I do want to just kind of throw that out there, that I do wonder if that was maybe a little bit of the reason why Ron decided to target him.
No, that's right. And actually, we did get to talk to Montour today. So, no, thank you for bringing that up, because that is important to mention. Yeah, he's going to be a really good presence in the room, and got the chance to ask him a few things about, why he would sign in Seattle and his thought process behind that whole deal. And he said the big thing for him was coming into something fresh and new, and that excited him. Also, as far as what he brings, he said, with me, you're going to see the enjoyment, the love, the competitiveness. And so I think the fans are really going to like him and what he brings to, as well as the players. And then also something I liked, he talked about how special it was to win a Stanley Cup. Because remember, he just had the Stanley Cup parade yesterday. He's coming off a cup win. I mean, he's probably been thinking a lot about that. But he talked about how special it was to win a Stanley Cup with Florida Panthers specifically, because they were a team that had never won a Stanley Cup before. And so bringing a city its first Stanley Cup championship, he thought was really cool. And so he said to do that with a new organization, that's the goal. So I think that's ultimately where his mind is at.
Yeah. And what more could you want to hear if you're a Kraken fan?
Exactly. So that's it on Brandon Montour, the player. But as he joins the Kraken blue line, it's looking a little bit crowded here. There's a reason we didn't look at defensemen last week in our free agency preview, and that's because we thought the Kraken were pretty satisfied with their 6 defensemen that they were going to next season with. Maybe would add a 7th as a borderline player, healthy scratch bubble type, but Montour is certainly not that. Mm-hmm. So the Kraken have 7 NHL level defensemen again. And we thought that maybe the Kraken would maybe move one of those out, that maybe there'd be a deal for a scoring winger. I mean, that was my big theory, is they'll move one of Larson, Borgen, or Alexiak to help try and get a scoring winger, because that's maybe something they could still use. But Ron Francis shut that down pretty well today. He said, we're happy with our 7, and asked about how they're going to manage Riker Evans being in there now, having to compete for a spot again against full-time established NHLers. He said that's what training camp is for. So that signals his intention to go into training camp with these 7 defensemen. What do you think about that, Dylan? Because it creates an interesting dynamic in training camp. I know a lot of us weren't so pleased with Riker Evans being scratched as much as he was last year. Does this create a similar situation? How are they going to shake this whole thing out?
I do believe him when he says like training camp will be like the time for this. And I think that he wants to see from Riker, and I think he also wants to see this from Maddie and Shane Wright with the Stephenson signing. Just, can they rise above? Can the competition there kind of bring out the best in them, and kind of have them go out there and get the confidence boost also of like earning their spot in the lineup. Right. And for Riker Evans, that truly means like actually playing games. Maybe for Maddie and Shane, it means something else. So we can talk about that later. But for Riker Evans, that means just actually playing in the NHL and getting those game reps. Now, I think Riker Evans just, helped Coach Dan get to back-to-back Calder Cup finals as kind of the guy on the blue line. I would be kind of shocked if Coach Dan didn't go with his guy, as one of the 6 that he's going to kind of regularly use. I think Riker Evans is also just ready. He's just good. He looked like he was too good for the Calder Cup finals this past year. I just think he's absolutely ready for the full-time gig at the NHL level. For me, I think the odd man out would probably be Will Borgen. That's probably the one that I think of as being the healthy scratch. We'll see if something else changes. Obviously, there's always going to be injuries, so it makes sense that you'd want to go in with having 7 guys, knowing that, hey, a month into the season, you might be down to 6 just because of something happening. So I don't hate it from that approach. I also don't hate it from the approach of, just kind of looking at the situation, right? Adam Larson, last year of his deal, I believe, trade deadline time comes, the Kraken are a borderline playoff team. I could see them, retaining half of that 4 point whatever it is, and flipping him at the deadline to a contending team that wants to just use you could use a rental defenseman, and the Kraken getting a nice return out of that. So I think between injuries, between trade deadline, I could see them entering the season with 7, but I don't think we see all 7 of these guys on the roster by the end of the year.
I would agree with that. And yet you'd think they'd have injuries, but this blue line has been unnaturally healthy for the last 2 years. Maybe this is the year that changes. I mean, it can't continue forever, but yeah, it's become an issue before because everyone stayed so darn healthy. And it's not just Larson too. You have Borgen and Dumoulin, whose contracts will be up at the end of this year too. So that gives you some options later in the season or at the deadline to maybe flip one of those guys if you feel that Evans has taken that step to be a regular. That's something you can do. And if you need to go acquire a depth defenseman or something at the deadline, that can always be done as well. And you're still going to be positive from an asset standpoint. So I don't hate it, but if it starts costing Riker Evans ice time and opportunities, then I'm going to sour on it as it goes along. And maybe they'll make some trade after training camp and everyone's, let's say Evans impresses again, he earns a spot, and maybe all of a sudden they can move a Brian Dumoulin or something to kind of free up a spot. It's always something they can do.
Right. And, from an injury perspective, even if there's not an injury with the Kraken, there's going to be defensemen going down around the league once the season gets underway. And then if you're Ron and you're operating with 7 NHL defensemen and some other team just lost an important piece, then's your time to make the deal, right? You've got some leverage there in the ability to make a move. So I could also see something like that happening where, again, you carry them through training camp. Whoever earns a spot, and then maybe a month or so into the season, it doesn't make sense to have that extra guy sitting on the bench the whole time, and you have a better idea also of like maybe what your forward group is looking like if you want to make a true NHL for NHL trade. So I could see something like that happening as well.
Right. But for the time being, it is these 7 defensemen. And I think, Dylan, we should probably take a stab at guessing maybe what the D pairs are going to look like, given that it's these 7 to start off the season. What do you think?
Yeah, we could do that.
I think we should, or what we would go with. We maybe predicting is a little too hard, but what we would go with these 7. First question, I guess, do you think Dunn and Larson stay together for the majority of next season? And would you do that?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit. Yeah, you could. Look, Larson, everybody knows he's my boy. He had a rough year last year, right? If he looks rough again, I don't mind the idea of, for the regular season, especially because this team just needs the offense so much, doubling up on Vince Dunn and Montour on the top line. Let them eat 24 minutes a night and just kind of go for it. You know what I mean? Like the rest of your D pairs aren't bad. They can move the puck a little bit. They can keep things okay for the other half of the game that those 2 guys aren't playing. But if you're going to say, hey, we want to really get this team going and we're going to try to win games 3-2, 4-3, whatever it is, having those 2 guys on the ice at the same time might make some sense at various points throughout the year.
I mean, situationally maybe, but I think I'm going to disagree with you here. I do think it's a bit redundant having 2 guys that are your primary puck movers on the same D pair.
As rough as he did last year, because you can't.
I gotcha.
Yeah,
I know he looked rough last year, and so, but I just think well, then you're putting him with maybe a Jamie Alexiak, and is that going to look any better? I just think the chemistry there between Dunn and Larson is going to help get you through. But really, I think it's just wasting Dunn and Montour, putting them together because they're your 2 best puck movers. And especially if you're coming out of your D zone, right? They both excel at moving the puck from the D zone out and kind of feeding that transition. Only one of them can do that at any given time. You can't have both of them simultaneously make a pass out of the zone. So I think you're kind of wasting that by having them both on the ice at the same time. That's why I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, well, and that's the sorry, RJ, that's the obvious answer, right? And like that's what makes the most sense, and that's why it won't happen for the most part. It's just it became very clear at various points last season that yes, it's not the most mobile blue line up and down. Certainly not, I would say, Alexiak, Borgen, Larson, and Dumoulin. They don't move well, and they don't move well defensively either. And so if at some point for the Kraken it makes the most sense for you to just have guys out there that can move, you'll have to overload the ice time with the guys that can, and that would mean maybe even going with a rotation. Like nothing says you have to be married to the concept of strict defensive pairs either. And maybe this would be more of a postseason thing to do, similar to what Dallas did this past postseason. But I could see the Kraken maybe having to do something like that. Also, if you do overload the two of them together, you still have Riker Evans who can move the puck and make those outlet passes and help drive the transition. Brian Dumoulin can still do that in a limited capacity if he's your guy to move the puck on the third pairing. So it's not like the end of the world if you were to overload them at the same time. I just think that there's certainly going to be situations, say, in third periods where the Kraken are down a goal, where it might
for sure.
Go ahead and just make that the pairing. And then the whole situation's a little bit more fluid than, say, us trying to like structure out a line pairings now.
That's true. And I guess covering a Dave Hackstall team got me maybe a little too used to that because the D pairs just, I mean, change them within game situationally sometimes, but man, those pairs would not change. So I might have to think a little bit outside the box here. All right. So I think I'll give up on the rest of the D pair predictions here because I think you make a good point with that.
Yeah. And otherwise I think you could go Alexiak Montour as your two if you keep, Dunn and Larson one, and then Evans Dumoulin for me as the third pairing. Knowing that, give Riker as much leash as he can take. And if he is ready for like second pairing stuff, then go ahead and move him up there, or heck, even move him up to the first and play him with Dunn, because then Dunn, realistically, because this is what's so complicated about it all, is Dunn is your best defensive defenseman, as well as before Montour, your best offensive guy. Right. And that's one of the things that I like about Vince Dunn is that versatility that he now has, that he's added that defensive ability to his game. If Riker Evans is looking really strong, he's confident, he's moving the puck well, I could see a situation where Riker Evans ends up playing with Vince Dunn, and then you have Montour with Alexiak, and then maybe Larson goes at the trade deadline, or he ends up all the way down there with Dumoulin.
Yeah, you know what? I could see that too potentially. That'd be a fun D pair, Dunn Evans. You might make you nervous at times, but it'd be a fun D pair. So overall, seems like the Kraken are going to go with those 7. And you know what? Hey, this is fun. It gives us a lot of questions going into training camp to see what exactly that looks like and a lot of things to look out for. Definitely.
It's going to be my most watched battle. Is going to be that one. I think maybe there might be another one that more people are going to be looking at, and we can kind of transition over and talk about the Chandler Stephenson signing, because the theme of the last half week or so, RJ, for Ron Francis has just been centerman, whether it was at the draft or now in free agency. Got to go out there and find more centers. You can never have too many centers. And the Kraken bring in Chandler Stephenson, also 30 years of age, 7-year term, and then I think the cap hits 6.25.
That's correct.
Yeah. We talked about him last week on the podcast. You brought him up. A lot of Kraken media members have been bringing him up for a while as a potential, additional center for the Kraken to bring in. I've always kind of poured cold water on it. It's here, though.
It sure is here. And let's kind of dive into this contract here. So it's 7 years, 6.25 million AAV on that contract. And so, right, we did talk about this last week. And so I went back and looked at that video clip. I clipped it for everyone, put it on our social media. And we had some interesting things to say, I guess. I brought his name up because I thought he might be a good Yanni Gourde replacement. If you wanted to move Gourde, replace him with somebody who's a little bit more offensively minded, right? Someone who can skate a little bit better, play that transition game. And looking at the projections, I believe the projection on him, actually, I can just scroll up here on my
5.5
notes. Yeah, it was 5 times about 5.5. And at that number in term, I figured, okay, you're paying him till he's 35. Maybe that's a year too long, but it's probably okay if you have to do it for a free agent, right? And that's only a little bit more than what Yanni Gourde is making. So it's kind of that 1-for-1 replacement. The cap's going up. I liked it for that reason. But this signing does not seem like that. It is 7 years, so 2 years more in term than what I would have thought. And at 6.25, that's a significant jump up from the cap hit as well. But maybe we should have seen this coming, because you, was trying to pour cold water on it, you asked me the question, well, how are you going to convince Chandler Stephenson to sign here and at least, maybe in the long term, play fewer minutes, because he was playing a lot of minutes in Vegas. And if he's signing that long-term deal, eventually with Matty Beniers and Shane Wright at center, his minutes are going to go down. How are you going to convince him? Why is he going to sign here? And I kind of just like, well, dollars in term, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? This is dollars in term. I guess this is how you convince a player like Stephenson to sign in Seattle. And as a result, I mean, should we talk about the on ice fit first, or should we just get into the elephant in the room with this contract?
We can get into the elephant in the room.
All right, let's jump right into it then. As a result, the value on this deal is, I'll just say it, it's bad. It is a bad value. It's too much money. It's too much term. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is a contract, I will say, that will probably age poorly, but also this, I think, falls into the category, I hate to say it, of one that's a bad contract the day it is signed. And you see that a lot on July 1st. And Ron Francis might be the first person to tell you that a lot of these contracts look like this, because he's said in the past, 2 days scare him on the hockey calendar more than any other days. And one of those 2 days is July 1st. And there's a reason he doesn't usually get involved and make deals like this. And that's because you have contracts, I think, like this one that probably aren't going to age the best. I mean, the analytics community was certainly pretty scathing on this one. As far as the value, I know Jay Fresh says it has potential to be a catastrophic contract. Looking at some of the other, some of the other people here, I was trying to pull up what Dom Lucian said, because I thought he summed it up well, basically saying that even if he plays up to his absolute potential, he just makes the value for this contract. Yeah, entering his 30s without Mark Stone babysitting after his decline last year, it feels like a terrible bet to make. I don't know. I don't know how you justify this one from a value standpoint. Right here, Dylan, you go ahead and add what you're going to add.
Yeah, I mean, this one doesn't make sense for several reasons. One, if you're the Kraken, you have to expect that for the most part, your top six down the middle is set for a while, just because you have Matty and Shane, and you can, certainly the idea of bringing in a center for this season isn't crazy, because you can always have Shane Wright ease in, start on the third line, work his way up, kind of thing. But when you're talking about a 7-year term on somebody who's going to be down the middle and eventually, in theory, be your third line center, I guess, you're talking about him very much kind of having a claim to one of those top six spots for a little while. And then once he's bounced out of it, that 7-year term means that, we know Matty needs a new contract now this offseason. It's probably going to be a bridge deal. Chandler Stephenson's contract will still be on the books after that bridge deal's done, because that's only going to be like a 2 or 3 year deal. So now you're going to have to pay Matty his big contract while you're also paying Chandler Stephenson. And Shane Wright, you've slid his contract as much as possible. But again, he's got, 2 years of ELC left? Or does he have the full 3 still? He's got the full 3.
Yeah, he has the full 3 because he got the slide this year. Yep.
Yeah, so he's got the full 3 years of ELC, but then again, you've got 4 years left of Chandler Stephenson. Even if you were to bridge deal Shane Wright after his ELC, you're going to then have that contract expire before Chandler Stephenson is off your books, right? You're talking about so much time that you're going to be paying Chandler Stephenson to clog up one of your spots down the middle, while you're, in theory, top 2 centers, your franchise cornerstones are going to need to be paid and need to have ice time. And then again, like, all things go well, Chandler Stephenson is the most expensive third line center in the league at 6
pretty much
5. Like, I really don't understand this one. He's pretty much a true center. I don't think he can. I know everything lists him as also a left wing, but he really only is productive when he's a center from a point standpoint. I don't understand it in any way. The analytics don't make sense on this one, right? We know the Kraken, Ron, he listens to that great analytics department that the Kraken have put together. That's one of the things that made the Brandon Montour signing make sense, was even when he's not putting up points, hey, he's at least driving possession, and he is very much the guy responsible for that. That is not the case here. No analytics, outwardly anyway, like Chandler Stephenson. I was going to say love, but they don't even like him, right? Like, every player card in every model I've seen is just all red. It's not good. So unless the Kraken really have something going proprietary that says to the other, I don't understand the decision making here from just a roster construction standpoint. The term with the 2 other guys you have, analytically speaking, I barely understand it from a coaching fit standpoint on the ice too. Like, I just don't get it.
Right. And you mentioned also that he doesn't drive play, or at least the analytics don't show that too. You look at his time in Vegas, and he spent a lot of his time with Mark Stone, who is an elite play driver. And Stevenson still, I guess, if you look, at the analytics numbers, everything, kind of dragged him down basically, and kind of, dried up a lot of the scoring production. Yeah, go ahead.
Last year in the regular season, Chandler Stephenson was essentially the only Vegas Golden Knights forward to have a negative relative expected goals percentage. The
Right.
only
And I
one.
mean, yeah, that's meaning it's lower when he's on the ice
Yeah.
than it is when he's off the ice. And so you can see the negative impact, at least through the numbers being made there. And yeah, that is rare for Golden Knights forwards. You don't really see that. And so to see that from Stevenson it's worrying. And so that's something that a lot of people in the analytics community have pointed out. Also, there's a reason that these kind of deals are rare. I did the comparison with Montour and the company that he's in, as far as 30 years old, 7-year deal. And I mean, the only other name there was Pietrangelo, and that actually did, at least so far, work out pretty well. But you look at the contracts here. So this is every free agent forward who is 30 or more years old, signed for 7 or more years, at least 7% of the salary cap. I believe Stevenson's 7.1. And it's Chandler Stephenson, Nazem Kadri, where that contract is already looking pretty rough. Andrew Ladd, who ended up getting LTIR'd into oblivion. That contract was bad in 2016. Brad Richards in 2011. That one got bought out. And then finally, Marian Hossa in 2009, which I don't believe he finished that one. That one kind of got LTIR'd, but that was a better deal at least. They won some cups under that one. Hossa was a good player. Chandler Stephenson is not Marian Hossa. Marian Hossa is borderline Hall of Fame level. Chandler Stephenson is just not that player.
Right. The cup's in the room, RJ. He's got 2 rings.
See, that was a theme, I think, and especially with the Kraken using the picture of them both holding the cup. Ron Francis in his official statements pointing to guys with a pedigree. Let's see, a winning pedigree, talking about Stephenson, and championship pedigree, talking about Montour. This was definitely something that I think they were looking into, and if you have culture issues potentially in the room, bringing cups in the room, bringing guys who are well respected, and we've only heard good things about Stephenson off the ice, so we're not criticizing anything there. That could help, but still, from a value and roster building perspective, it still just makes no sense considering the other things you could have done. And also, quickly talking about the Yanni Gourde replacement, why I thought maybe he could be a good fit. At least if you believe Ron Francis, it doesn't sound like they're going to do that. He said they're done with big moves, just filling out the Firebirds roster and all that stuff is all they're doing for training camp. So I don't even think it's going to be the Gourde replacement.
No, I mean, Let me finish on him real quick, and then we can talk about like what this means for the forward group as a whole, and
go ahead.
really down the middle. One of the things that I had mentioned as being weird if you were to sign him last week when we were talking about signing him, was that, look, you're then signing in a guy who's coming in with the mindset of basically trying to keep a job from one of your 2 franchise cornerstone guys in the top 6. Because if you're him, and especially now that we know the term and the dollar amount, why wouldn't that be his kind of goal, right? Obviously, he's valuing himself as a top 6 player. This is a top 6 contract. And so that's kind of awkward. At the same time, like I talked about with Montour and having the 7D with Riker Evans, I think this is really good for Maddie and Shane because it gives them some competition here, right? Maddie all along has kind of been gifted that top 6 role just by nature of the Kraken not having anybody. He was kind of thrown in there. And he's had some success. He's struggled at times. We know that, confidence when it comes to certainly shooting the puck and scoring has been an issue with him. That's been something that they've talked about, and how streaky he's been. Ron Francis has mentioned that, several times throughout last season. So again, if he's able to earn a roster spot over a Chandler Stephenson, well then, or a top 6 role over a Chandler Stephenson, well then that should help. That should be a pretty nice confidence boost, right? That's a pretty good sign from the coaching staff that they really believe in you and that you have earned that. And if you're an athlete, you can take that and run with it. I just don't know that that's going to happen right away. And then I think with Shane, this means that they're definitely going to ease him in, and then Shane's going to have to beat him out next off season. But it's just a weird kind of thing. I like the defensive side. I don't know that I love it on this side of things, just because you're talking about two guys who have already kind of had to go through some iffy confidence stuff in their development path here, and now you're throwing a big roadblock in their way. It's very much like throwing them in the deep end of the pool, and then maybe also like having it be a wave pool. I don't know. It's not going to be easy on the two of them.
No, it's not. And that's I agreed with your point, I think, last week too, about it being weird that that's the mindset that Stevenson's going to have to be in. But we know that Ron Francis likes competition for those spots. You can see it with the choice to roll with the 7 defensemen, right? Riker Evans is going to have to earn a spot over established veteran NHLers if he's going to want to play right away. And I think that's going to be the case for Matty Beniers and Shane Wright. If they want a spot in the top 6, they're going to have to go out and earn it. And I don't mind it from that perspective from them. Right. But still, it creates this kind of awkward dynamic, especially with Stephenson knowing he'll be around for 7 years in theory. Where does that go long term? So I agree with that point there. I'm trying to think.
And then,
another point. Yeah, go ahead.
Just from a play perspective, because I know some other people have been talking about like, well, he brings like goal scoring and he should help with the scoring issue. And he doesn't really bring goal scoring. He's got 1 20-goal season to his name, and it was only 21 goals, 16 each of the last 2 years, I think. He doesn't bring a ton of goal scoring himself. He's more of a setup man. He is a very good passer. Like that is definitely something there. But with Ron just being obsessed with centers, I don't know necessarily, like, he isn't going to play with the same level of wingers he had in Vegas. Like that is for sure going to happen. So I don't know, because he doesn't go to the net front. He's not like a net front kind of guy. He's not a volume shooter, right? Those are two things we talked about the Kraken kind of needing to help with their scoring issues. And then even defensively, he's not a good defensive center, like at all. Like all the defensive metrics for him are really bad, like single digit percentages bad when you're looking at like JFresh cards and stuff. So I don't really know what to do there. I mean, his teams just get destroyed in the defensive zone net front. Like he just lets guys get behind him like all the time. If you look at the maps and stuff, who is it that has the maps here? The Michael Blake McCurdy maps, the shot maps. His offensive one, it's like stone cold by the net, and then if you look at the defensive one, it's red hot. Like other teams are getting to your goaltender when he's on the ice. So it's, again, I just don't understand this one. I don't see how the analytics team with the Kraken would have given the green light on this one. I feel like this had to come more from the traditional hockey side of things.
I would have to think so. And yeah, it's going to be a different dynamic for Stephenson too. I guess it probably signals a change in the way that the Kraken are going to play it, to be that kind of rush oriented team, because you look at where he excels, and it is using that speed on the rush as a facilitator. I think the word out of Vegas too is that people wish he would shoot more, which is something we're familiar with from middle six centers from the Kraken, right? But yeah, that requires other players that you can distribute to who are finishers. And I think the Kraken are a little bit short on that at the moment. So I do wonder how exactly that's going to work out. But I think, good points all around from you there. Is there anything else on Stephenson to get to before kind of talking how he, impacts the forward core, or any of the general takeaways?
No, we could talk about that now because, yeah. And even that, I mean, we talked about the competition standpoint between him and the two young guys. Yanni Gourde. If you're Yanni Gourde, how are you feeling right now, right? Because you're essentially right now the fourth line center of the Seattle Kraken.
Yeah, we kind of worked with the lines and played out what we thought they would be to start out. And almost any way you slice it, unless Yanni Gourde's moving to wing, he's the fourth line center.
Right. And because, I guess in theory, Shane Wright could be the fourth line center, but we've talked in the past, like he needs more minutes than that. He's not going to develop if you're giving him 8-9 minutes a night. So I just don't see how Shane Wright can be the fourth line center. You could move Yanni to wing, but like if I'm Yanni Gord, I'm sitting here and I'm going, I've got limited good hockey left in me just because of my age. He's I think 34 now, if I'm not mistaken. He's,
I
you know what I
believe
mean?
so. Yeah.
A guy like him, it feels like he's still got it and that he can go and help a team win a Stanley Cup. And yeah, if that means, being part of like the Lightning cores of old and being the fourth line guy there, maybe you do it. But if you're looking at this situation where it's like a borderline playoff team, are you going to be like wanting to use your best in the last year of like your good contract on just like maybe being the 8th seed? Like, you know what I mean? Like I got it and playing 9 minutes a night. I I got to think that he's probably thinking that he could do more than what the Kraken are now going to need from him.
Right. And so I do wonder what he thinks of this kind of move. And that's why I suggested maybe if you were going to bring in someone like a Stevenson, you might want to move Yanni Gord. It just might be better for all those involved.
Mhm.
And I think it's still something you can do just because, Ron told us that he was pretty much done for now. It doesn't mean that he can't change his mind or get an offer somewhere or move anybody mid-season. But it is another situation to watch going into dev camp to see kind of where he lines up and what the center situation is. Or maybe, as you suggested last week, moving Matty Beniers to wing. How do you feel about that? Because you did float that on the podcast last week. I think
Right.
you were saying Lindholm would be the signing to make to go along with that.
Right.
But do you think that's any more likely now that they brought in a center?
Not because it's no, because it's Stevenson that they brought in, right? Like
Okay.
that makes sense if they brought in a center who is a goes down the middle, play low in the offensive zone, be in that net front area because Maddie's a really good distributor from the outside. So it's one of those more like you're just having two guys play to their strengths, and even Maddie could play center defensively. Like it wouldn't necessarily be a traditional move to the wing. It's more so just pairing a net front guy with Maddie, who's very much a perimeter player. The problem is Chandler Stephenson's a perimeter player.
Right. Who do you think would pair best with Stevenson as far as line mates? I mean, early indications. We'll get a lot of different things at training camp, I'm
Yeah.
sure. But first thoughts on that.
I mean, it's just whoever can play fast off the rush. I think of Oliver Bjorkstrand as somebody being able to play fast off the rush. I think he could work with him, particularly just because of Chandler Stevenson's passing ability. Bjorkstrand, we know he likes to enter the zone, and then he does what not a lot of people do, which is he starts playing east-west, kind of just below the face-off dots there. And we saw him have some good success with that this year. Chandler Stephenson would be a guy who could find him in those spots and think at that higher level from a passing perspective and get him the puck in those spots. So Bjorkstrand is kind of the first name that comes to my mind. Berkey, if healthy, right? Berkey can be fast. He can play in a transitional style. He can go low in the zone and do that kind of grinded out work that maybe Stevenson doesn't really do. But also who knows with Berkey's availability throughout the course of a year and all that kind of stuff. But assuming healthy, I could see those two guys. In my opinion, they're the best attacking off the rush guys that the Kraken have.
And what about Jared McCann?
I mean, yeah, I guess McCann is I guess just good at everything. He's just like an elite player, and so if you want a guy like that, and certainly if that was to make McCann attack off the rush a little bit more, I think that would help get his numbers back up to where they were 2 years ago versus this past season.
Yeah, as I was working everything out as far as maybe a projected lineup, what seemed to make the most sense to me, at least to start trying out, would be Stevenson with McCann and Bjorkstrand. So we'll kind of see how that all goes. And at least early on, you'd have to think that he'd be getting some pretty big minutes, given that the other centers, Beniers, Wright, and Gord, probably wouldn't be in line for through first line minutes, any of them.
No, I mean, this is, and we've been talking about going back to a more traditional 1 through 4 setup from an ice time perspective than what Coach Hackstall did, where it was kind of more top 9 and then a fourth line. Chandler Stephenson, I got to think right now has the inside track to be the 1C, the one guy getting close to 20 plus ish minutes. And we heard Ron Francis say they want him to play all situations, or the plan right now is for him to play all situations. So, Chandler Stephenson right now seems like the only center I could definitively say is going to have, 20 minutes plus of ice time.
Yeah, I agree. I think he is going to get that opportunity at least early on. I mean, that's the kind of thing. If this was a 2-year deal,
Right.
it
It
looks
makes so
great.
much
It's such a
sense.
good fit. But the 7 years is kind of the sticking point there. I mean, anything else on the forward group before we kind of go big picture with these two signings and Ron Francis, his decision to be very uncharacteristic today?
No, it's just going to come down to and it's going to be, for Coach Dan, finding those pairs. Who's got the chemistry with each other? Where do you want guys? Do you want to keep Eberle as the veteran with Shane Wright? Does that make a lot of sense if it's going to be the third line? Eberle's kind of, slowing down maybe a little bit. We know, he took a little bit less on the contract and stuff like that to stay there. He could be a good mentor for Shane on the third line. Maddie needs somebody who's going to go net front. So think of like a Jaden Schwartz maybe being paired with him, somebody who's going to do that. Um, just it's just going to come down to training camp though. So much of the forward stuff. Like I know everybody wants to go out there and kind of guess at this and mess around with it, and there's certainly a lot of fun stuff to be messing around with. But I really don't think we're going to have too much set in stone before training camp.
Yeah, that is a lesson that can be learned. Never put too much stock in day one training camp lines. There's going to be a lot of things that are tried. And really, Bilesma doesn't know. The players don't know. Nobody knows
Right.
yet because you have to see how it works out in real life.
Yeah. And then
Okay.
last
Yeah,
thing
go
on
ahead.
Stevenson, face-offs. He does win face-offs. Like he is
Kraken
now
can use that.
guy. Like anytime there is a big face-off, Chandler Stephenson is going to be the one on the ice to take that face-off because he's the only guy on this team that is going to be consistently above 50%.
And that is something very positive the Kraken could use. It's something they've been searching for a long time. And so it certainly checks that box. So zooming out here as we just passed the hour mark in the podcast, zooming out to the big picture of things, I think it's worth talking about the big headline today. And I think it's the main takeaway that everybody should have. And that's that Ron Francis did something he's never done before. This is as out of character as possible for him, really. It's hard to overstate just how out of character this is for Ron Francis, who is normally ultra conservative with how he operates. Montour and Stephenson, as we mentioned earlier, the two biggest contracts in total dollars that he has ever handed out. And so, for better or worse, he's taken the big swings that some fans have asked for. And I think that's worth acknowledging because I think going into this offseason, a lot of fans have lamented about how conservative Francis has been and said that if you want something to change, you have to act differently. And I don't think any of us would have been satisfied with him doing essentially nothing in this offseason. He had to try something. And so he's tried something. But the question is what he did a good idea as you look at the big picture and what this means for the roster building? Because this is very consequential.
Mm-hmm.
These 7-year deals. It's not like he's brought in maybe someone like a Patrick Laine for 2 years where it's a lot of money, but if it doesn't work out, you can kind of wipe the slate clean. This is, I'm trying to do the quick math here of what, 13.39, almost $13.4 million here, tied up for 7 years on the salary cap. And that's a pretty significant amount of money. How do you feel about that money being there long term for these two players? What do you think from a roster building perspective, Dylan?
I mean, it shouldn't come as a surprise if I say I'm fine with it for Montour. The Stevenson one is sketchy at best, right? I mean, that shouldn't be a surprise given how we've talked for the last hour. I'm look, the offseason, all the boxes have now been checked, right? It was we wanted a coaching change in some capacity, even if it was just assistant coaches on the power play or something, right? But like something had to be changed there. There needed to be that acknowledgement from ownership, from management, that things were not working with the direction that they were going. They did that. They did the coaching change. They brought in the perfect guy. The culture kind of around the team needed to change. They did that with bringing in Dan and with bringing in these two individuals, because as Ron put out there, right, the idea of these guys being winners and stuff, it is, we joke about it a lot, teams going out there and trying to find cups in the room and whatever, but it is something that has been proven out. Like it doesn't always work, right? And the percentage of it working, as with everything in free agency, is low, but it is something that is good to have. And I do feel like it was something that the Kraken didn't have enough of last year. And that's why things spiraled out of control the way that they did. and the Kraken went out and found 2 players that have that kind of winning culture and understand that stuff and are good guys off the ice. They went out there and they got a coach that has won a Stanley Cup and that can generate a good culture. And we've talked at length about all the good stuff that Dan's going to do. But they went out there and they addressed the team, the coach. They went out there, they addressed the culture, and then they went out there and they addressed the roster today, and they did make big moves. Was it the big moves we were expecting? Did they go out there and they find that superstar scorer? No. But again, that superstar scorer wasn't really available to them and wasn't going to be available to them. And so I think Ron went out there and did the best with what he could do. It's just that on the Stephenson front, that one doesn't make sense to me. It still doesn't make sense to me.
Right. And with the Stephenson signing, I guess putting it all in context too, it is very un-Ron Francis-like, as we talked about. But I kind of want to ask why, because when you see somebody act in a way that they don't normally act, you have to ask, why are they doing this? And I guess I want to ask you, how much does this, I guess, kind of reek of some desperation here? Now, I did ask Ron Francis about this because I was curious about it too. I said, this is one of the 2 days of the year that always scares you. You don't usually sign contracts like this. Why did you kind of feel comfortable doing this, given the situation the team is in right now? And also I asked, was there any pressure from ownership to contend right away and maybe drive some of these signings? Now, he poured cold water over that immediately, the ownership pressure anyway. And he said, look, they allowed me to spend to the cap, but I do what I'm going to do. So at least from what he's saying outwardly, there was no pressure from ownership. I don't know if I fully believe that. Of course, he's not going to say, yeah, the owners had me do this. If that was going to be his answer no matter what. But I have to think, especially with the Stephenson's deal in as part of this, there might have been some more pressure than we would have otherwise known to try and get better right away.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know that he needed to make the playoffs. We've been saying that. So yes, was there going to be, from every move he was going to make this offseason, a little bit of that self-preservation thing? Yeah. That kind of goes without saying at this point. I think if you're going to look at maybe trying to read something in, maybe you read something into this becomes desperation for, say, Maddie offensively, or, Shane Wright, although Shane Wright's looking really good and he looked fantastic with the call up last year. So I would think it would be more so like on the Maddie front of, hey, look, he's taken all the steps forward you'd want from him defensively. He's a top 5 defensive center in the league, but boy, that offensive production is far from being top 6, And so if you're looking at this from a desperation standpoint or anything, I think you look at it as an insurance policy on Matty Beniers, in case Matty is just a defensive guy, and then he's more of like a 3C than anything. I'm not saying that's what this is, but I think, we've talked about it several times. He had to do something anyway. This is what he decided to do. If you wanted to say why he did this one specifically of the big move he had to make, that's, I guess, then the biggest thing you could look at would just be by signing him to a contract that screams top 6, then he's thinking that he might not have the 2 guys as locked into top 6 long term as maybe otherwise thought.
Right. I could see that. And I guess one thing that concerns me is that you look at these 2 moves and I think they make a lot of sense for Ron Francis and the situation he's in. I do think there's some self-preservation there. This is probably the least aligned I think his moves have been with the team's, his interest versus the team's interest. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I want to get it out here on the record on the podcast that the term worries me for both in the sense that, in the roster building sense, that you are committing that much money for that much term, because we talked about it. We just mentioned it, right? There weren't any elite forwards available. There weren't any star players available that you could go get. And really in the long term, I think that's what this franchise needs. Mm-hmm. But nobody out there right now, but you kind of had to act right now. What I worry about is that by committing this money for 7 years, you kind of hamstring your ability to act in the future should somebody become available that you need to go out and get and pay for. And I know there's always surgery you can do with the roster and work you can do. I just plugged it into Armchair GM for next season, kind of predicting a Beniers extension, a Tolvanen extension, right? And, you don't have a ton of money anymore when you're building for the long term, because next year you're going to have to basically rebuild most of your blue line. You're going to have to, I know you have Montour, but you're still going to have to fill 2 defense spots. and you're going to have to get another goalie because Joey's contract is up, and you're going to have to fill 3 forward spots, and you're going to have about 16 million to do that. And that's not a lot of money to do all of that. And so now if a star player becomes available, you're going to have to really do some reworking on the roster. Look, it can still be done, but this does, I think, really hamper your ability to do that should an opportunity arise. And so looking at the long-term flexibility, I think this really ate into that. And that, I think, more than anything else, is really what's bothering me with this from a roster building perspective.
Right. And I think that's justified. Like I said, you know, one bad-ish deal is survivable. What you can't have is 2 on any roster, right? Like you can look at teams that have won the cup the last couple of years. Basically, every team in the NHL has got 1 bad deal on the books, right? You can work around that. Having 2 is where things become more difficult. And again, I don't necessarily even think that the Montour deal is going to be that bad, but it's a lot, and it's just a lot on the books. And again, just the fact that you have to go out far and think about what Matty long-term, his number is going to be, past the bridge he's going to sign, what Shane is going to be coming off his ELC at some point. Because as we just saw with Matty, that ELC goes faster than you think. That's the problem. And having the Stephenson contract where you have that much money locked up down the middle as a franchise, that your 2 potential homegrown superstar players are centers, and now potentially 3 with Berkeley Catton, by the way, who Ron very much was referring to as a center and talking about wanting the center depth in the system post Goyette and Rykov moving to the wing. That's what doesn't make sense here is just the contract you gave to a player at that position, and then the player specifically on top of it. It just doesn't line up with the other stuff that Ron's been saying or acting like, and that's what makes it so strange.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Berkeley Catton too, because yes, he might be 2 or 3 years away from making any kind of difference at the NHL level. But you know what? Stevenson's going to be there for 7 years. Right. Catton will be well into his career by the time that contract is up, and so it actually is something that you might have to contend with and consider Berkeley Catton. So that's a whole other issue there. And I think, by the way, we should mention with the draft stuff, because there's a whole bunch of draft things to talk about too. We'll probably get into that in a little more detail next week. Or that's the plan, right, Dylan?
Yeah. And then it makes sense also because then it's post dev camp. So we can talk about the draft and who they picked, and then as well as how they performed and stuff at dev camp and how it all went down.
Right. Just thought I should put that little footnote in there for everybody. So anything else, Dylan, on the big picture of this before we talk about kind of little news and notes? Because we did get to talk to Ron Francis after all of the moves and everything today. And so there were kind of some tidbits because we got a lot of information from that. So there's some tidbits we wanted to share and discuss, but anything before we move on to that?
No.
All right. So as I said, we got to talk to Ron Francis, and I think it was very informative. That's for sure. He was great answering all our questions. So I guess, as already mentioned, no big moves coming. It just seems like this is it for the off season. No plans to move out of D. Let's see. Also, I should mention for these contracts, since we just talked about Montour and Stephenson for a long time, I did ask if there was any trade protection on those contracts. And yes, there is. So both Montour and Stephenson do have trade protection. They've got no trade clauses. They are full no trade clauses early on in the contract, and then they turn into partial no trade clauses later on in the deal. He didn't give specifics about exactly when. I have a feeling it might be different for each player, and going from memory is tough there, but I'm sure details on that will come out a little bit later. Cap Friendly has their ways of finding out, although they're going away in 5 days, so maybe we won't find out. We'll see, but want to get some clarification there. So they do have some trade protection. Moving on to the non-player news here for a second. So as far as the coaching staff, because Dan Bylsma still has to fill out the coaching staff, they're still looking for assistants. And of course, they're still looking to replace Bylsma as the head coach of the Coachella Valley Firebirds. So Ron said they're working on all that right now, and they're probably going to have assistant coach news in the next week or so. So everyone keep an eye out for that. But he did provide some clarity on the assistant coaching search. Dave Lowry will be part of the staff, so he will stay on for sure as part of the Kraken coaching staff. Anything to add there about the coaching situation? I guess we'll find out more in the next week or so.
Yeah, we've talked about like some of the stuff we would like to see and stuff in the past. At this point, it's just waiting for the actual news before we can really break any of it down.
Right. So we talked about the forward situation. We talked about the D situation. Let's talk a little bit about the goalie situation. So we know Joey and Gru will be back as the two NHL goalies for next year. But do have a little bit of clarification here on what the AHL situation looks like. So the Kraken did re-sign Ales Stecka to a 1-year deal, and Ron did confirm that he will be the starter for Coachella Valley next year. And personally, I like that move. I thought he was pretty impressive in his time in Coachella Valley as the number 2. I think he's earned that kind of bigger opportunity for that job. And then also mentioned that Nicholas Coco will be here next year, and that he may alternate between Coachella Valley and Kansas City just to get the most playing time. Because, of course, as a prospect goalie, he needs to be playing games, getting action. Thoughts on the goalie situation? Also, Victor Ostman is part of that as well, and so he'll factor into the mix also.
Yeah, I mean, look, as we knew, you're not going to have, NHL goalies at Coachella Valley anymore. We knew that day was eventually going to have to come. I like the situation that they have with the young guys of working out, like, they can kind of swap spots as backup in Coachella Valley versus starter with the Mavericks, and then you can, ensure that everybody's getting the playing time that they need to develop properly. I think the plan that they have makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, agreed. As far as extensions for Matty Beniers and Ellie Tolvanen, because that's still on the to-do list for sure. Ron says that he's been talking to their camps. He's working at it, trying to get something done. He's talking to Matty's camp tomorrow. So we'll see if anything comes from that. But yeah, no news there, but he's still working away on those extensions.
Yeah. And I mean, again, we'll just kind of have to wait and see what they end up being.
Yeah, and he did talk about John Hayden also, though the Kraken did sign him to a 1-year extension, a one-way extension, which, by the way, I want to say congratulations to John Hayden on that. That is a significant raise from his existing salary. I believe he was on a 2-year deal, but certainly well-deserved for someone who is very well-liked in Coachella Valley. I mean, we've had the chance to go down there. We know from the people down there how much they love him in Coachella Valley. So he will compete for a spot at training camp, as is the case usually always, right? He's going to compete for an NHL spot, and we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's news a lot of Kraken fans wanted to hear, and again, Coach Dan, very familiar with him, so I think he's going to have a good chance at putting himself in a spot to make the roster in training camp, and then hey, with the 1-year deal, if it doesn't work out and he does have to go down to Coachella Valley, he's going to be making some good money.
Definitely. And so we should mention with the Firebirds too, the Kraken did sign 5 players to kind of fill out the Firebirds roster as well. Let's take a look at those. Ben Myers, Mitchell Stevens, Brandon Biro, Nicholas Brouillard, and Maxime Lajoie, those 5. So that's kind of what Ron Francis was talking about too, as far as that being on the to-do list, filling out the AHL roster. So they're doing some of that, and we'll have a picture later as we go into the summer of what that Firebirds roster might look like, what each of those guys are going to do. But that news just came out right as we started recording, so we don't have a whole lot of information on those guys quite yet. So we'll cover that later. But yeah, those are the notes and everything from Ron Francis' pressers. Anything that I missed? I feel like he gave us a lot and talked about a lot of different things.
He gave us a lot, but I mean, this podcast is going long, and we'll have plenty of time over the off season to talk about it all in a lot of detail.
That is true. There will be a lot of housekeeping, a lot of cleanup next week, I am sure. But I think as we approach an hour, 20 minutes here, that should do it for the Deep Dive podcast, right? You want to take us out, Dylan?
Yeah, I mean, one more chance to say, go join RJ on the 4th for his Armchair GM, the last one with cap friendly existing. So you can be there for that on the last day of the website's existence if you want to, and if you can't make it, you can leave your question on the Patreon post that he's going to be putting up here shortly. So go check that out over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey. Another huge shout out to Queen Anne Beer Hall. Thanks for taking care of RJ and the wonderful ECH community the other night for Game 7.
They always do.
Final. I hopefully am going to be able to get over there on this trip up here. And I'm looking forward to that. And then that's going to do it for us here. Thanks everybody so much for listening, and we'll see you all next time.